Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Azzuddin Hawam, the founder of Sadaa Echoes. Welcome to Unbounded Stories. Today is a special episode. First of all, I want to introduce Sadaa to you and welcome you all to Sadaa. Sadaa is a storytelling initiative rooted in amplifying voices that are often silenced, marginalized, or reduced to fragments. It is a space where stories are not extracted but honored, where memory, land, and identity are held with care and love. I founded Sada Echoes as a platform where people come together and tell their stories the way they are, where storytelling becomes a living practice of resistance, a way to humanize, to remember, and to insist on the fullness of our existence. Today, Unbounded Stories tries to dig deep into the big theme of joy and grief. Together today with my friend Melanie Bisson, who I welcome very much on this episode, we're hoping to navigate the notions of what is grief, how does somebody witness grief, and how do we remember joy, and is humanity able to host and hold both things, joy and grief, together? And I ask the question that follows all of that is who has the right to grieve and who has the right to hold joy? So, with that, I welcome you, Melanie. Thank you and shukran for being with us. Could you tell us a little bit about you and what brings you here?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Um, Maybe I'll start with where we met and how that relationship and that conversation has developed. And maybe we can move, in the past and in the future from there. So you and I met at a leadership meeting. There was no intention to talk about grief, but during one of the moments in the meeting where there was some downtime, um, I met you, and then I had expressed to you that I had just I was finishing a thesis exam on the topic of grief and how we can support grieving students, in particular grieving adolescents in school, how schools can be better prepared to welcome grieving students into their classrooms and into their spaces. And so from there, I guess I'll ask you a question, because I know that that first question that you do ask is um, how our identity is shaped. And my first question to you will be, what drew you to the topic of grief when I started talking about it? Because for me, grief is incredibly relational. And so when we hold not just the topic, but the event, the experience, and the feeling, we do welcome more easily those around us that are also having that experience. So, um, what drew you to that topic when we met?
I love your question, Melanie. And I think as somebody who tells stories of Palestine and someone who talks about Palestine often, I'm often viewed from a grief lens. When I
Mm,
tell people I'm from Palestine, often the response is, "Oh, I am sorry about what's happening in your country, on your land." While I respect and hold these remarks very dear to my heart, but I can't help recognize that often I am seen through that lens of grieving, being, broken, a lens of that reduces my story to one thing, which is being in crisis or
right,
shaped by conflict.
right.
And so I am often trying to expand, if you will, those conversations to say, yes, I do grieve, and I hold my home and land and community together in my heart, but I'm also in that grief. I remember, I witness, I connect, I talk to my community, I hold, I resist, and in those things I find joy.
Okay, right. Yes, and that makes me think a lot about how um, our bodies and our lives are not just sites of endurance. Um, they are meant to be lived fully and completely with all of the experiences that come to us. And our aliveness um, really does give us permission to live the full spectrum of what's here. And part of what's here is grief. And the reason why I got so interested in the topic of grief probably started during COVID. So during COVID, I read an article, and in the article, it stated that what people were experiencing in this moment was grief, and it was the first time that I really heard someone explain an experience where everyone was like, well, where people were alive but grieving, but not necessarily the loss of a life, but the loss of experiences, the loss of connection, the loss of togetherness. And from there, I really started to explore, what was like the daily ebbs and flows of grief that we experience in our lives. So there are those large moments of grief where we lose someone that's very dear to us, but there's also those small or secondary experiences of grief that we have throughout the day. And how do we hold space for those experiences in a more holistic way, if that makes sense? Does that make sense? Yeah. So um, in that time, I lost my father right before COVID happened. And so I was in a state of grieving. And from there, I really started to think about how this grief was shaping my identity, but also like how the many moments of grief that I've had in my life have come in and reshaped my values, if that makes sense. So if I think back at like the first experience of grief that I ever had, I was 5, and that's the first one I remember anyways, and it was losing my grandma. And at the time, I didn't understand that she had died. I didn't understand the idea that her spirit was gone. And so at the funeral, I have a very vivid memory of my mom taking my hand and putting it on my grandmother's face in her casket. And that moment just terrified me. And I could not understand why my grandma was right here in her body, but her essence, her soul, and her life were gone. And it was for, I think it took probably 3 or 4 months. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, crying and screaming for my mom. And my mom came into the room, and I asked her, "Are we ever going to have her pierogies again? Does this mean that we're never going to eat Mama's pierogies again?" And I think that that's the first real memory that I have of this like moment of grief. And when I look back from that part or that point where I started to explore it more academically, I really started to see how these moments had really molded me into this person who was now going to try to understand what was happening to my mind, to my spirit, to my life through those events. So I went into this academic world and explored, the many parts of grief that are measurable and cognitive and experiential. And it was so interesting because I finished that, I defended my thesis, and then I I really, took a moment and thought, oh, wow, like I learned a lot about it, but it hasn't made the pain go away. And it didn't make the grief more palatable to understand it, through text and research. And so when I think about my identity, and you had graciously given me this question beforehand, it was really the one that I had the most difficulty with, because our identity is so ever changing,
Mhm.
and it's hard to even like map all of the ways that we're changed through these experiences in our life.
Mm.
Yeah.
And truly, just thinking about your grandmother's story, I mean, can we truly fully grieve? That's a question that I come back to.
Yeah.
To hold all of that heaviness, I always want to weave in certain moments of joy. So, to think with you then, Melanie, how do you have you found moments of joy and tenderness within those difficult, hard, lonely moments of grief?
Hmm. Yeah, I think, I played around a lot with the word joy as well. And I think that is can be a very fluid word. I think that where I was able to find tenderness was later on in my life. I think that like there were moments where, so the first memory I had, of course, was of my grandma, but there were many grief experiences that followed that. And some of the biggest grief moments that I had in my life were for strangers.
Mhm.
There were some for people that I knew, of course, and those were deeply, deeply painful. But I think what it brought to me was, in the reflection of them, who was I? And some of those big painful moments for me was, who did I lose, in parts of myself? So if I think about my father dying, I mean, he died, but also parts of me died with him, like the way that he saw me in the world and the way that he experienced me in the world was lost as well. And so grappling with that was also a huge part of like the shaping of not just an identity, but like a loss of identity as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so does then, Melanie, does joy then become an act of reclaiming parts of that identity in your thoughts, in your opinion?
Yeah. And it takes time, of course. Um, but what I did learn to do was, in those moments of deep grief, um, was learn and train myself to go to the edge of that grief, like whatever edge I was able to get to that day, and soften. And of course, like you said, the grief can't be felt all at once in one big moment. Like it really is something that we travel with and throughout our lives. And I've often said that like I walk hand in hand with my grief now. It's become my friend. And I've often said that my own death has become my advisor. So, in reflecting on the deaths of those around me, how can my own death guide me in my life?
Mm.
How can, what kind of person do I want to get to the end of my life with and feel peace? So, joy, in those moments or in certain moments, we're really acknowledging um, the people that I lost and honoring them. My life continues, theirs is finished. And how do I carry the lessons and the experiences that I had with them forward in a good way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and when I think about reclaiming joy, for example, I mean, we can go into so many areas of like using joy as a resistance and as a reclaiming of ourselves, if that makes sense. Um, I it's so grief is so isolating in times, and being able to, you know, bring ourselves back into our own body is really that moment of being able to soften
Mm.
into that moment.
Yeah, this notion of gentleness with one own self. I love that.
Yeah, allowing it to be there.
Mhm.
And I think that oftentimes we don't allow grief to be present in our lives. And not only that, unfortunately, and we've had this conversation before, grief is not always allowed or permissible to everybody. Um, we have systematically like allowed systems to decide which emotions are allowed, which people are allowed to grieve, um, who is allowed to have those rituals, and who is not.
Mhm.
And I think you probably know that intimately as well. Um, yeah. And but I guess my question back to you would be, in your grief that you've talked about, where have you been able to find joy as a resistance?
Yeah, and I thought about those questions very, very deeply when I was thinking about our conversation. I think for me, the ability to publicly state that I'm grieving has been a form of resistance for me because often I wasn't allowed. And we've talked about this, Melanie and I. In fact, we sat down with the notion of colonial spaces and how they are designed to not allow for such thing.
That's right.
And often we as people of color or marginalized community members were talked about or told to grieve quickly.
Hmm.
And that grieveness becomes a burden on those colonial spaces if it's spent too much in,
Right.
if we take our time through. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate the notion of grieving as a reclaiming, grieving as notions of resistance. I now say I want everything that was taken away from me, including my grief.
Yeah.
And so that's a good segue to the next question then. For us in this world, and we share spaces together in the education system as well, how do we then stand, sit with, walk with those who have been denied the opportunity to grieve,
Yeah.
those who have been silenced, maybe have lost, continue to lose, but not able to grieve?
Yeah.
And so what is our collective duty here for people who are listening today? How can
Yeah.
they walk with those who have been grieving without taking over their stories, without taking over their grief, but rather than offering them that gentleness you talked about earlier in
Yeah.
saying, look, I am with you here if you need that space.
Right. I think the first thing that we can do is name the injustice of silenced grief, and see where that injustice really lies, and refusing to let the systems decide which emotions are allowed and who's allowed to grieve. Silencing grief is never neutral. It is political. And not allowing grief in the spaces is, well, it is a way to not take accountability for some of the grief that has happened, to those around us. Not holding accountable those who have maybe inflicted that grief if that makes any sense. So I think the naming of the injustice, and also refusing the hierarchy of grievable experiences is really important as well, right? Like whose suffering matters, and whose lives matter.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful note to bring us to a close here. Melanie, if you could, we talk about grieving, but we often miss the notion of healing. And maybe it's talked about, but it's talked about away from grieving. I want to center both things together. And often when we talk about healing, sometimes I and others go and think about healing long term, like forever.
Mm,
But maybe I'm talking today with you about healing just for today,
right.
like the healing that is needed for today and maybe tomorrow, just the 2 days.
Right.
So, what has grief taught us then, or taught you, in terms of recognizing the importance of healing? And what could we tell people who are listening about healing?
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, healing is a lifelong journey, and we move, right? I mean, wounds are always there. We move around them, we experience them. But when we talked about joy, like I just want to, maybe go back to that for a second. And that, like, joy is not a betrayal of grief. It really honors the people that we loved. And I think that part of that, that healing or that moving with the grief is remembering that, like, you know, witnessing and experiencing our own grief is collective care, and making room for it um, brings a story to it, which is everything that you talk about, right? I'll also say that in that collective care, I've often seen grief as one of those great equalizers in life. There are not that many that all of us will experience, but grief will be experienced by all of us. And, um, it's not a neutral space. It's a collective space where a lot of care is needed. And unfortunately, we do live in a society that suppresses grief, doesn't want to hear it, um, has decided that it's quite inconvenient to getting the job done, um, you know, getting on with your day. But but I think that in the healing space, we open ourselves to not only our own experiences, but those around us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
Melanie, thank you for your love, care, and I think on that notion of collective grief, you and I have shared those moments together when we shared stories, but we also shared moments of joy and
Yeah,
moments of friendship and humanity.
that's right.
So I want to say thank you so much to Melanie for joining us today on Unbounded Stories. And for those who are listening, I want to leave you with Sada Echoes was founded for those who did not have a voice, a platform to come through and tell your story the way it is. So keep sharing your stories. Come be with us. Join us for our upcoming Unbounded Story series. And if there is a story you want to share with us, reach out. I am honored. I will be always honored to share your space with you, whether it's in person or virtual, and to bring about healing that unites us and brings us closer.
Yeah. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to just share maybe one last a poem.
Of course.
Yeah, it's called Adrift, and it's by an author and spiritual writer called Mark Nepo. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but um, it really spoke to me the first time that I read it, and I hope that it encaptures, like, some of the conversation that we had here today. So I will read it for you and your guests and your watchers. So, Adrift. Everything is beautiful, and I'm so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze that makes the birds move from branch to branch, as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I'm so sad, and everything is beautiful.
Thank you, Melanie. That line of looking for those who have lost in the next room, my mind and my I went straight to my grandmother's house as I looked for her. Once I arrived there, she passed away when I was in Canada. I couldn't see her. So as
Yeah,
soon as I made it back home, the first thing I went is searched for her within the walls, within the rooms, within the smells.
yeah, that's
So
right. Yeah, and I mean, even as we sit here right now, I have my father's sash on my thighs. I have the light that, I keep on for my cat that just died recently. And as I even look around my place, I just see so many pieces of things that people have left behind for me, and they cover my walls and my book space and my entire life. And I think that that's the essence. I think that that's where we can carry wonder, togetherness, memory, and that healing that we talk about.
thank you, Melanie. I appreciate it. And I hope and pray that we continue to hold both things with tenderness and care. Thank you,
That's,
folks, for being with us. Thank you, Melanie and Shukra.
thank you.